picking up where we left off, this is the letter H that we designed in part 2 of the series for Intro to Typography. If you haven't seen the first 2 parts, jump back and check out Document Setup and Designing this H. And in this section, we're going to be designing a letter D, capital D, and we're going to cover building the spine of the letter with the pen tool, and then also creating a closed shape out of that, and how we can benefit from that with the stroke, and then creating that into outlines. So this will delve a little bit more into proper use of the pen tool. In the H tutorial, we just drew straight lines, which doesn't really exhibit that very well. So I'm going to go ahead here and lock the H layer. I'm going to lock everything inside it, and I'm going to hide the H layer. And then I'm just going to create another layer for myself. You can go through and name these layers, by the way. If you name them the letters that you're designing, it's actually pretty handy. I'm not doing that just because I'm lazy right now, but you know, you organize you do you. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I'll design this D in a somewhat similar fashion to this letter H. Shouldn't be too hard to do. So I'm still going to do this with the pen tool though, and as you would imagine, the letter D is going to go from the baseline up to the cap height, and I'm going to hold shift and make sure I'm constrained so that's vertical. And then actually I'm going to back up here because I just clicked and I didn't drag a handle, and I really want a handle to work with for this next stroke. Yeah, well, no, actually I think I'm going to add a small straight segment here so that I have a little more to work with. So what I'll do is I'm just going to drag a handle out this way. So you can actually, I'm just holding shift to constrain the direction of this to horizontal, but you can actually click, and then after you click, hit Alt or Option, and then you can drag, and that'll get you a handle going one direction since you started it after you clicked creating a single point, and not the other way. And I don't really need a handle going off to this other point because that's always going to be a straight line. If I need one, I can add one later. But I'm gonna hit shift to constrain to horizontal only. I'm going to drag out to you know, a reasonable distance here for my curve for the back of the D here, the bowl. And then the next point that I'm going to draw, when I'm making this curve, I want to draw it with as few points as possible. The fewer points that I add to a curve, the smoother the transitions will be, because the computer will do all the work and the math for making that curve. And then I can adjust that with the 2 handles that I'll give myself here. You'll notice that I'm drawing this in a clockwise fashion. You can draw them either direction, but when you go to do certain operations like knockouts or some of these Pathfinder operations down here, it's nice to have paths that are going the same direction. So I tend to draw things in a clockwise fashion, and then if I ever need those, they're available to me without extra hassle. So when I draw this curve, something that I'm going to be paying attention to is where this handle sits, and then where my next point is going to be. Something that I want to try to avoid is creating a curve that has that overlaps. And what I mean by that is if I were to draw this next curve, that doesn't really exemplify it. If I drew it way in here for, you know, just to magnify this, you would see that this curve is no longer just a single curve. It's actually got 2 curves. One curve out to here, and one curve down into here. Well, that's bad, because we actually only have 2 handles to control 2 curves, and that's not a really great ratio of inputs to output, right? We have 2 curves, 2 handles. Yeah, you could say you have a lot of control over that, but you really don't, right? Because you can't move the apex of this curve very easily. You have to kind of fight with both handles to do that. So what we actually want to do is always make sure that the point that we draw starts after where this handle is. So farther out this way, out to the right. So I'm going to draw it out here for now, and we can adjust this later. I'm going to use the cross height as my center, even though it's not actually center. I'm not in a geometric font here, so I'm not going to be all nitpicky about getting it exactly centered. The cross height is actually slightly above center, so it should, using this cross height for my curve of the D, should give me a slightly more stable looking D, just because the curve will, we pandered a little bit more toward the upper half of the letter. And we can adjust that later if we want. So you'll notice I use shift to constrain and drag just vertical handles here again. So in both cases I'm using horizontal or vertical handles. And one nice thing about that is that if I go to make edits, I can always hold shift and stay on that axis and know that I'm not going to mess up and pull it the wrong way or be inconsistent with the directions that I'm pulling my curves. Right? If you always use points that are on the extrema, meaning the highest, rightmost, lowest, or leftmost points, and you always constrain your handles to be dragged horizontally or vertically, then you have some nice rules for yourself as far as staying consistent when you draw paths. So I'm going to continue my path here. I'm assuming that I'll need to edit these handles, by the way. I'm just guessing as to where they'll go right now. But I'm probably going to come back and edit those a little bit. So it looks like I don't have my smart guide helping me align with this point right now, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and drag a point down here to the baseline, and we can align those a little bit later. And when I'm dragging this handle, really I'm caring about the backside, right? Yeah, my mouse is going left, but it's this one on the right over there that I'm caring about, because I want that to be somewhat similar to the one on the top. Well, I can't see the one on the top right now, and that's kind of a pain, right? You could grab the path on the top and copy it and paste it in and merge the paths, but this is just an easier method to get to roughly the same place. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that, and now obviously this handle out here is extraneous, right? Like that's useless to me, because I'm just going to draw a straight line from here to here, and I obviously don't want to go over here in the path. So I'm going to hit Alt or Option, which will get me this this alternate form of the pen tool, or it's a direct selection or direct modification tool, and there's probably a name for it, but I forget right now. And I'm just going to drag it back into its parent point here, its parent node, and that'll just delete it. It just gets rid of that point. So now I'm just drawing without a handle from that point, and I'm just going to draw it over to this anchor and close my path. So now I'm not drawing anything. I've got a closed path on the page. And now would be a really good time to go back and make some small edits, right? So like I can use the direct select tool by hitting A or just clicking up here. And I'm going to select, by holding shift, these two anchor points. And then I'm going to align them just by clicking the horizontal align center tool here. And that's in the align palette. If you don't see the align palette, it's in window align. You can show that. So I've now aligned these so that they're vertically aligned with each other, so I know that there's no problem there. Unfortunately, you can't really use the align tool to align handles, because it's kind of difficult to go in and select multiple handles at the same time, and that's by design, right? So there are a few ways you can get around this. You can either copy and paste the curve so that you get the exact same curve profile. Another way you can do it is to actually set yourself a guide somewhere, and then just use the guide to drag the handle to the guide, and go do the same thing to drag the same handle down to this guide, and then when you're done, just delete the guide, because it's just a temp use thing, right? Yeah, and then once you have similar guides, you can go back and select these points, and you can modify them both at once by nudging and things like that. But you've always got that guide trick up your sleeve. So something I'm noticing, this looks like an OKD, but I actually want to bowl it out a little bit more. It seems like it's almost just a semicircle here, and that seems a little bit too geometric for the font style that I want. So something that I'm going to do to bowl it out, or I guess block it out would be a better term, is I'm thinking about getting it closer to a square here, right? Like not very far, but just a little closer. Again, I could probably do some measurements, or if I just drag these up, I can drag up and down. I'm actually not shooting to be symmetrical here. In some cases, in geometric cases, you would want to be. But in this case, I actually want the D to be slightly more boxed out on the bottom than on the top, because that will make it feel a little bit more stable, right? If it's a little bit more curved, then it'll feel thinner on top, because it's reaching out into the white space less, and then it's reaching into the white space more down here. And that will make it feel more stable. It'll feel wider on bottom, thinner on top, so it's not like it's going to tip over. Now, obviously, we've got just a solid shape here, and we have to make a cutout. We have to make a counter cut here against the D, right? So the way that I'm going to do that is a little bit counterintuitive. It still uses stroke, but the nice thing about this is that it automatically uses a similar stroke weight to like the H that I designed earlier. I'm going to go ahead and just hit the default styling here, which will get me a white fill, which I don't want, so I'll cancel the white fill, and a black stroke. And then I'm going to come to their stroke palette, and I believe it was 15 point that I used for the weight. Now, obviously this is a problem, right? Because I'm overshooting the top of my cap height, and I'm overshooting my baseline by a considerable amount. That's far more than the 1 to 3% I might want for a letter like this. And so what I'm going to do is I will actually just come into the stroke palette here, and I will align the stroke to the inside of the shape. Now, this only works when you have a shape that is a closed path, right? This D is closed. This is a closed counter. So I can do this. If it's not a closed path, then there's no inside to the stroke, and I can't align it to the inside, right? Yeah, now I see that there's a problem here, because when I align my stroke to the inside, it messes with what I perceive to be a good form of a D, right? Like this counter is too small. This whole thing feels too heavy. So just from a design standpoint, I'm going to fix that. It's pretty easy to fix. I'm just going to select these two anchor points. Those are the ones between the straight lines here. And then the apex of the curve over here. And I'm just going to shift and hit right and nudge all of those to the right. That's feeling closer to correct. I don't know. I can play around with it here and see exactly what form I want. I'm going to go with something like this. So now I have a form that is 15 point stroke, and its stroke is on the inside of the shape, and so it's very easy to modify where the outside of the shape lands because I have a path along that. And I know that everywhere throughout it's 15 points thick. Now, obviously, again, with optical corrections, the vertical stroke is going to feel slightly thinner than 15 point, and a horizontal stroke is going to feel slightly thicker. And in the curve, it's going to be some gradient thereof in between. So probably all said and done, I'm going to want to come back to this and do some slight optical corrections. But in this case, because I'm using the stroke to extrude this path into a 15 point thickness, I can't really adjust much of any of that until I've actually made this into a solid shape. So I'm going to go ahead and make myself a copy right now because I want to be non-destructive, right? And so here, Command C, Command F to put it right in front. Then I'm going to lock the bottom one and hide the bottom one, and I'm going to keep working on the top one. Don't think that these guides are something that I need. I must have accidentally copied those at some point, so I'll just delete them. So I'm going to select that top copy again, and now I'm going to turn this into a normal shape instead of a path with a stroke, because I'm getting close to correct form for my D here, even though it hasn't been optically corrected. And so I'm going to do that by Object, Path, Outline Stroke. And just the same, it takes a stroke where it sits, and it outlines it for me. All right, so now I have several more points added. I have basically the same ones on the outside, which is cool. It didn't modify that for me. But you'll notice that it added like these extra ones kind of in here. So in type design, you always want to try and make curves with the fewest number of points possible. So I might actually consider coming back and modifying these out. So there are two ways to delete points on a path, and they have different consequences. There might be more ways, but at least two ways. So if I direct select that point and I just hit delete, I've broken the path, right? It's no longer a closed path. So it closes with the styling, but this point is not connected to this point except through the whole way around. So I don't really want to do that because I want to preserve this path more or less. So I'm going to back up here. If I hit the minus key, that will get me a modified version of the pen tool. You can also click and hold to get here, to the delete anchor point tool. When you delete a point using the delete anchor point tool, it will keep it connected. Yeah, that information is not there, so the profile of the curve changed, right? But these two are still connected now. They're just governed by this handle and this handle now, instead of no handles. So I'm going to do the same thing with this one because I don't really want it there. Now I'm going to go back to the direct selection tool with A, or up here, and I'm going to drag these handles out to where they seem appropriate. And remember, I'm doing both of them, so I need to kind of drag both of them to make it feel appropriate. All right, and I'm just guessing here as to exactly what this will look like. You could probably be a little bit more measured and methodical about exactly where you want these curves to land. But this is, at this point, you would be starting to think about optical corrections, right? If you add a little bit more weight in this curve, or this curve, that could compensate for some of the weight that you lose in the transition between vertical and horizontal, and also could compensate for some of the difference perceived in horizontal versus vertical strokes. So you'll probably want to think a little bit more about exactly where you drag these handles. And if you just back off and take a look at it, you get a decent looking letter D and a nice pared down number of points. Now these points look like they might be extraneous, right? Like they're not useful, but they actually are because they're setting the base point for the curve here. And we don't actually want the curve to come all the way up next to the spine. We want a little bit of straight space here in the D, just its letter form. So in the same way that we have another point out here, we have another point down here, and these are kind of sister points. So when you're looking at the shape of a letter, it's always a good idea to think about points as sister points. This corner has a sister point here. This corner has this edge has a sister point here. This apex has a sister apex here, and so forth all the way around. If you have sister points, then there's a good chance that you have very similar controls with those handles, and you can create very smooth lines that appear like they're around the same spine of the letter. So sister points are a good way to sort of manage everything. So there's a letter D, and we got there by a little bit different method, but we learned a couple of things about the pen tool. Remember, we learned that you don't want to cross your anchor handles when you pull a curve. You always want to make sure that they're not quite crossed. So like this, direct select here. Oh, yeah, interesting. Yeah, there we go. This anchor or this handle doesn't come past where this handle would go, and likewise this handle doesn't come past where this this handle would go, right? They would meet somewhere out here in space, and that's exactly how we want it. If you do something like this, all of a sudden you're introducing a second curve down in here, and you really don't want that because it's a little bit harder to deal with. You have fewer handles for more curves, and you get less control. So that's one thing you want to think about with using the pen tool. Another thing you want to think about using the pen tool is where you place your points. Placing them at the extrema, the top, right, bottom, and left points, is a good way to allow yourself to use rules of dragging vertically and horizontally with your handles to stay consistent in the way that you draw curves. It also allows you a full amount of control. Like I can do whatever I want with this curve, knowing that it's a curve that goes down and right. Right? And if I want to make another curve, I can make another line segment that goes down and right, or down and left, or up and left. It doesn't matter. But if I always follow these rules, then every curve will always go one direction, and it will have one curve for each two handles, which gives you a nice full amount of control for each curve. The other thing we learned about using the pen tool and extruding into shapes for letters is that you always want to try to shoot for having sister points on each side of the letter. Right? So those are just a few tips in using the pen tool. And of course we learned a few keyboard shortcuts and tooling pieces, like how to use the delete anchor tool. You can also add an anchor point, or you can change or modify an anchor point using the anchor point tool here, or just draw a new path with the pen tool. So those are a few things we can do. Let's see, we created the spine of this letter with the pen tool, and then we extruded it with the stroke, and then we outlined the stroke once we had a closed shape, and then we turned the stroke in to the inside of the letter, and then we modified the letter for visual appearance, and then we turned that into an outline, and then modified that outline as we saw fit for creating a letter. Something we haven't done on this letter yet is to create a space box. So if we take a quick glance at the H, we know that we have about this much space to the left and right of the H, right? So it stands to reason that we have a very similar amount of space that we're going to want to the left and right of the D, except that the D has a curve going on, right? So I'm going to move this D over here so that it's aligned with the H. You don't have to align your letters in your workspace, but it's kind of handy, right? And then I'm going to actually just grab the rectangle here, unlock, oh come on, unlock, grab the rectangle, copy it, lock the layer, and then hit Command F. Oh, no, select the D layer, hit Command F, and now I've got a rectangle in exactly the same proportion, not the same space, as the H. But I can drag it and very easily align that to the same spot as the H. Now, I'm going to hide the H layer again because we don't need it at this point. But you do notice that the D isn't as wide as the H, so we're going to need to take some space off the right here. But on the left side, it has a similar form. It has a vertical stem. And so we can expect to see a similar amount of space on the left side. We might want to edit that later, but for now, we'll just call it the same. And then on the right side, we definitely have too much space. So we can estimate from the farthest point of the D that we want about the same amount of space as we have on the left side of the D. But we actually don't even want that much space, because if you look at the form of a D, there's a lot of white space that happens in the top right and bottom right areas. And if we give ourselves the same space on the right from the apex of the D, this feels like too much. When you put another letter next to it, there's too much space here. So let's trim a little bit of that space down by just eking this space box in close to the D. And then when we place another letter here, the space will be accounted for here by bringing this space box in just a little bit and tightening up that space on the right side of the D. So it's a form of optical correction. You're just dealing with the white space here and what people would expect to see for space around the figure D. So there's a letter D. We're going to do a letter S next, which is one of the hardest letters, so I'll show you a little bit of my methodology there. So stay tuned for the next video.